I've known Jim Paquette since the day he first stumbled on it, and recorded it for the public. We didn't meet in person, though, until yesterday. I've been following his site and what he's been doing. And what I said about stumbling, anybody can stumble on anything, but it's what you do after that, and that's what he's done. He's discovered, and then he carried it on in literature that he's written, and in sharing with everyone else. That's what makes it special, and what makes him special. So here he is.
Why, thank you, Larry. Thank you very much. That was a real nice introduction. I'm going to try it without this because I can talk pretty loud, and one of the problems I have with using this is I'm French Canadian and I can't talk without using my hands. Okay, and if anybody has a hard time hearing me, raise your hand and let me know, or just remember that there's a lot of seats that are closer up here too. This is like going to church here on Sunday. Today, what I'm going to talk about, Bob, when you asked me to come up here and speak to this to this group here, I was real excited about it, and I had a lot of different things I could talk about actually. And he asked that I come and I talk about the Gordo site, and because certainly it's one of the most important archaeological sites that's ever been found, certainly here in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, but also throughout the Great Lakes region. And the title for the talk, you see it there, it's called The Find of 1,000 Lifetimes. And I know there might be some people, when they read The Find of 1,000 Lifetimes, they might think that that's sort of a way of sensationalizing this discovery. But it certainly doesn't do that at all. And the reason, actually, I came up with that, and I got to tell you this before I start, was that after we made this discovery, of course, with Dr. Marla Buckmaster from NMU, we published in the Wisconsin Archaeologist a preliminary report on the site. But it needed more than just what we wrote, and we never did really follow up, nor did anyone, with any additional information on the site other than that one preliminary report back in 1988. And I knew as time went on that I personally had better start recording exactly what happened, not only in terms of what did we find, such as you'd see in an archaeological report, in a technical report, but how did we come to find this site? What were we thinking? What was happening, on a more human level when we made this great discovery? And so I got asked by Michigan History Magazine sometime back to write an article for Michigan History Magazine, and I did pen that. I put it together, and it was called "The Find of a Lifetime." Okay. And it was on the original manuscript, and I submitted it down to the magazine, knowing that it was like about 5 times longer than what their editorial guidelines said it needed to be. But I still thought it was way too short, and I thought, well, if you want it, here it is. And I thought, even if you got to use your whole magazine, this article's that good that you should probably do it. Well, they didn't. They disagreed, and they said, well, they sent it back and said you're going to have to shorten it up if we're going to publish it. And I gave us some thought about doing that, but I had another choice, and that second choice was to expand it rather than, and that's what I did. And I worked on it for several years on the manuscript. And the more I thought about as I worked on the site and as time went on, and certainly I had an early appreciation for what we discovered, but as time went on, I saw more and more that appreciation grew, and I understood how important this particular site was. And particularly, not only because of what we found, but of the circumstances that surrounded the discovery. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so I actually added the word, the find of 1,000 lifetimes, because it wasn't just the find of a lifetime, and certainly it was the find of my lifetime, but it was a discovery that was really so rare. And again, not only for what it was, but under the circumstances involved of how the stars lined up, that it was indeed the find of 1,000 lifetimes. And so I wrote the book, and the book was actually published, and I got copies of it back there, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of this. But what I want to do here today is to go back in time and to take you back in time to not only what led up to the discovery, and it really was in a sense a chance discovery. And Larry said it right. Like, we literally stumbled on it, and stepped upon it in one way. but there's a little bit more to it than that. But I also want to go back and introduce people here to some of the very first people that actually lived right here in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and here in the Upper Great Lakes region, because that's really what's the most important thing about this. The artifacts themselves are certainly important because of what they do to the archaeological record, but we can never lose sight of the fact that these things belonged to people, and people who were very, very much just like us today, and just like our families. And that's the really important thing, that when we look at all of these artifacts, and when we study archaeology, it's easy sometimes to lose sight of the fact that these are personal belongings, that these represented people's lives and their livelihood, and how people attempted to make a living for themselves and for their families. And so that's part of what we're going to be talking about today. I put this together in just like when I wrote the original article for Michigan History Magazine, how I decided that it was too short and I had to expand it. As I worked on this and I knew I had an hour to talk, I couldn't help but keep adding slides to it, so I'm going to have to go through this kind of quick. But anyway, one of the things I always talk about, because there's a question I always get, that I've always gotten through the years, is I'm not a professional archaeologist per se, and although I do a lot of work with professional archaeologists and work on professional archaeological projects, I don't have a PhD in archaeology. In fact, I've never taken an archaeological class in school or in college. But my interest in archaeology goes back to, I thank this person here, and I always talk about this guy every time I give a talk, no matter what I talk about, because he inspired me. And this person here was my grandfather, and his name was Medolphe Paquette, and you can tell by that name that he was French Canadian. But he was also very proud of the fact that he wasn't just French Canadian. To himself, he considered himself French Indian. He was Métis. He was a French Canadian and a Anishinaabe Iroquois mixed blood. And I grew up as a young boy growing up, and my grandpa died when I was 16 years old, so I got to spend a very good part of my life, that early part of my life, growing up knowing him very well and being around him a lot. And he taught me a lot, and as my father did, because my father is like a carbon copy of my grandpa. And but my grandpa he was very proud of who he was. He was very proud of that he was French Indian, that he was French Canadian Indian. And because my grandpa was so important to me, anything that was important to him was important to me, okay? And so I became also, as a young boy, very proud of my heritage, very proud of the fact that I was Métis, that I was also of mixed heritage here in the Upper Great Lakes region. And one of the things that I did as a young boy, of course my grandfather lived in Kingsford, Michigan. We didn't live on a reservation or anything like that. And to learn more about who I was and my heritage, if you will, as a Native person, I couldn't rely on other tribal people. I had to go and do it from books. And so what I did was, as a young boy, I read everything I could possibly find on Native Americans. At Christmas time, what do you want for Christmas, Jim? Oh, I want a toy gun and I want a book on Indians, And it went on for years, and so I developed my own little library of myself. But I began to expand, and I went out to read other things. When I finally went to college, I had that interest, of course, had followed me right through my whole childhood into my adulthood. When I was trying to make preparation to go to college, my interest interest went from just cultural studies into archaeological studies on my own. And I wanted to be an archaeologist, and that's really what my dream was to go away to go to Michigan State and enroll there. But the problem was that although my heart at the time was with the archaeological program at MSU, my wallet was with the social work program at Northern Michigan University. Okay, you understand? And so, and also when I was getting ready to go to college, Northern offered me some great scholarships that gave me a full ride to Northern academic scholarships. So I ended up going to Northern, and where I got a degree in social work. And so I never got my degree. I never went on to become a professional archaeologist. But it didn't stop me from studying archaeology. And I thought, well, if I want to be an archaeologist, and don't take no offense to this, any people here are archaeologists, but I thought, how hard can it be? and so what I did was I just studied on my own. And once I got to Northern, of course, I had access to all of their resources and into certain people. And even though I didn't formally study it, I hit the books. And I continued that. My initial interests were pretty widespread, and I was interested in all of archaeology throughout North America in particular. And then I became more and more focused to regional archaeology, and then I became more and more focused to just, okay, what was happening here in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan? And one of the things that I saw, that the more I read the literature that was out there, and I'm talking back in the 70s and in the early 80s now, okay? And the more I looked at the literature, one of the things that I saw, that there was this glaring emptiness on archaeology. And that was the archaeology of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And I found it pretty amazing that when I looked at, I began to study sites that, some of the archaeological work that had occurred in Wisconsin or Michigan, and certainly, up in through Ontario, and particularly over on this end over here. I saw virtually nothing that was reported on the archaeology of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And of course, we knew about the Riverside site, and there was a few sites down on the east end here. And we knew there was copper up here that people had been mining, but there wasn't much that had been done in the archaeological terms with any of the sites in the UP. And so I went to, I actually asked a professional archaeologist back in the early 80s, I said, why is that? I said, why, when I look through the literature and I see this, hundreds or literally thousands of sites that have been actually been reported, and hundreds that have been reported on and written in the literature about throughout around the UP, but I don't see hardly anything about the UP, and I see zero on the county that I live in, which is Marquette County, which is the biggest county in the Upper Peninsula. And why is there nothing on that? And the answer I got, and this was from a professional archaeologist, the answer was that, well, the reason is that you don't see anything written here on the central UP in particular is because there's nothing there. And that was the answer, that was the actual answer that I got. And I said, well, really? I said, boy, you would expect there to be something there if there's something everywhere else. And they said, yeah, but I said, well, why would that be? Honest to God answer. Well, the weather's cold here. It's not a really hospitable place for people to live, especially back in prehistoric times, so there's really nothing there. And so I thought, well, and at first I took it for what it was. I thought, well, that's coming from a very learned person, respected person. And I took it for what it was, but then I started thinking, nah, there's no way. And I thought, well, I want to see what other people have found. And so I really tried to scour through anything I could get information on it to see what had been done. Maybe, did somebody actually go out there and look? Was there reports? And I did find just a scattering of information on some of the surveys that were done along the lake. But the reason nobody ever found anything in Marquette County was because nobody ever looked in Marquette County. There had never been a formal survey of any sort being conducted in that county, in Marquette County. Huge, huge area, the whole central UP. And so what I decided to do was I thought, well, there's only one way to find out for sure, and that's for me to get out and actually look. And what I did was, and this was back on May 12, 1984 was the day that I stepped out my front door and I decided to go out and see for myself if there was anything out there, if there was archaeological sites, cultural sites in Marquette County. And I picked a spot that was, I picked Teal Lake in Negaunee. And the biggest reason I picked it, people ask me, why'd you pick it? I said, well, because it was 2 blocks from my home. And that was the biggest reason I did. And what I decided to do was that, I also began this survey on Teal Lake, not because I was good at archaeology, and take this for what it's worth, it's because I was good at math. Because based upon what I was thinking, it was a mathematical certainty that there had to be sites on Teal Lake. And now listen to what I'm saying. Even though nobody had ever found anything, I'm thinking, well, the history of Teal Lake, the geological history of Teal Lake, it's a early glacial formed lake, and it's inside the boundaries, outside the boundaries of the Marquette Advance. So the lake has probably been sitting there for 12,000 years. And I'm thinking, well, maybe people didn't like living here, but what if somebody just once every 1,000 years happened to come and stay on Teal Lake, every 1,000 years? That means there's got to be 12 sites on that lake. And I thought, it's a mathematical certainty that there's something on that lake. And I picked the spot, and where I decided to start was here on the east end, and this is on the northeast end. When you're driving through Nagano, you look across, and you look over and you see these white bluffs. This is called the White Rocks, actually. You see this beautiful bluff here. That's where I started. That's where I went. And when I went over there, again, my experience as an archaeologist was pretty much zero, and I was just an armchair archaeologist based upon what I read. So I knew that, but I also knew something else. I knew that I was darn good with a metal detector, and because I was one of those, I was a coin shooter. I had never gone out and looked for copper Indian artifacts or anything like that, but one of my hobbies was finding coins, and I was really good at it. And I thought that if people back then we didn't, the dates, we don't have some of the C14 dates that we have now that extended, back in time, the use of copper here. But back then we were thinking that, well, copper probably went back maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years, back to the old copper culture, and maybe a little bit before. And I thought that, if anyone over there had camped over on that side of the lake and had dropped something made from copper, that if I could actually go out in the city park and find a copper Indian head penny, that it was probably pretty easy for me to go over there and find a copper spear point, okay? And that was part of what my thought was. And so what I did was, I got off and I went on this end of the lake. Now, one other thing that happened, and you talk about being lucky rather than being good, because I was not good, I was lucky. The spot I happened to pick for the very first survey, if you will, of my archaeological life, this corner right here, it couldn't have been in a better spot, because these outcroppings you see here are pure high-grade agibic quartzite, okay? And of course, the agibic quartzite being a favored raw material of people for thousands of years here in the Upper Great Lakes. Plus it's sitting right here on the lake, so what do you think is sitting over here, where I decided to go? It's an ancient quarry site, and it ends up to being that. And it'd be the same thing as if, I often thought about it, that if some clueless alien ever came down to Earth and decided that, I heard there's this thing called money on Earth, and I'm gonna go see if I can just walk out there someplace and find it. And I think I'm gonna start where that building is that got the words B-A-N-K on it. And that's where I'm gonna start, okay? And it was the same thing. I literally walked over to the prehistoric bank, if you will. And what I did was, I just started walking along the shoreline, and on that very first day, within the very first half an hour, I fired up that detector, and all I did was walk the trail. I didn't go off into the woods. I just walked the trail that had been sunken down, or people had been using for years to go over to the swimming holes. And by sweeping the detector in that trail, nobody had ever gone there. Nobody had ever looked for anything over there. Guess what shows up? Copper. Copper artifacts in a lot of them. And it's just strewn along the trail system on that north shore. Some of the copper was similar to what you see here, some blanks and some pieces, but there was a lot of formal tools that were just laying there. There was like knives and some points and such. Certainly the most spectacular copper artifact that showed up in one of the areas over there was this 18-inch long copper pike. This right now is if you ever go to the Marquette Regional History Center, in their first footprints display, you'll see this there. I donated this, as I do everything that I have, to either universities or to museums, and this is sitting in that museum. And I encourage you to go there and to take a look at the displays that they got. But of course, besides the copper that was there, the other thing that I noticed that was laying about everywhere was quartzite, of course, and that's because for making and using quartzite tools. And here you can see this is like within that quartzite quarry, this big block of beautiful white gray agibic quartzite. You can see all of these where it's been hammered away, where people in past times had actually quarried it. And I'm holding this large flake that was laying there. And I also noticed as I walked along the trail systems in the same places that the copper was laying, that it was scattered with lithic debris. And a lot of it was flakes. There was some formal tools. And there was just a ton of FCR, a fire-cracked rock. In some areas along that north shore, it was actually just a pavement of FCR that was laying in there. But what I did was, I as best I could, based upon what I knew what to do, I documented everything I found. And I fired off all of the information that I had, plus a state site form down to John Halsey's office down in Lansing. And I tell you what, I was ecstatically glad because I'd gone out there and I'd actually did what I thought I could do. And that was to actually find a site, to find evidence of prehistoric peoples living in Marquette County. And it couldn't have been better. And in some of the stone artifacts, I'll show you, these are some of the very first stone artifacts that I picked up, again, that were just laying on the surface. And to a lot of people look at these, they just look like just rocks. And that's the reason they're probably still laying there, because nobody ever picked them up. But here, this is actually a well-made biface. It's like a semi-lunar biface. It's got a cutting edge that's been flaked down to this end here. This is just a large block piece of quartzite that you can see a lot of big flakes, but it has some battering and some edge use down on this end here. This is just a very simple flake tool. It's just a large flake of quartzite, but it's got a lot of flaking and use marks in here. And this again is just a flake of quartzite, but it's been very heavily used. It's hard to see on the photographs, but there's edge retouching that's going along the edges. And these tools, when I first looked at the tools, you know, I knew they were old. And when I tried to compare them myself to what I had seen in the literature, they did compare very favorably to shield archaic artifacts that are found, that we just talked about, that we just heard about, that are found on the north shore of Lake Superior. But they also, but when you look at here in the southern part of the basin of Lake Superior, and you go down into the western Great Lakes, they compare favorably to early archaic Paleo-Indian artifacts, who also used quartzites as a favored raw material. Well, anyway, after I brought everything I had, I also brought it up to NMU, up to Northern, and I opened up and developed a professional relationship with Dr. Marla Buckmaster at that time. And of course, Marla was really fired up, as were a lot of people, about what I had found on the lake, on Teal Lake. Again, it was because nobody had expected it. Nobody thought it was there, and here it is. And so because it did generate a lot of interest and excitement, the very following summer, Marla put together a project. It was funded by NMU and the Negaunee Historical Society, and they co-funded an archaeological survey on that north shore of the lake in the same areas where I had made all of the discoveries the previous summer. And these are some of the photos that were taken then. And it was a 6-week project, and it included just, you know, your shovel testing, test excavations, and site mapping. Okay, so just a real basic 6-week survey of what we did. And what we found, excuse me, went the wrong way there. And what we found in terms of actual cultural material when we excavated on the sites, we found much the same that I had found the previous summer. We didn't find any copper. I'll say that during our excavations in 1985, during our test excavations. But we found some very interesting stone artifacts amidst the FCR and everything else that we found. And what we found were some, what looked to be very, very old human artifacts, okay, in the upper Great Lakes. And again, a lot of what you're going to find, of course, anytime you work on an archaeological site and you're doing excavating, the thing you're going to find more than anything, of course, are usually is going to be the flakes. And we found a lot of course, quartzite flakes, you know, for local algibic quartzite flakes. But one of the things that was mixed in with the flakes, with those flakes, was this magic rock down here. And that's Hixton silicified sandstone. And that is, or that was, the favored raw material of Paleo-Indian cultures that lived in the western Great Lakes, okay? And so, but it was just the flakes. But beautiful flakes of some beautiful pieces that came off, it's beautiful, nice wide flakes that came off of bifaces. We also found a couple of bifaces. And again, you can see that they're very large. You know, what they were was these large, this is a real good one. Again, this isn't a local quartzite. That's not algibic quartzite. That's a purplish quartzite. That's, I've seen that material before on other sites, and it's not local Marquette County quartzite. That doesn't occur here. It's probably coming from Wisconsin, okay, from northern Wisconsin. Anyway, this created certainly a lot of interest again, and certainly for me, I was totally ecstatic, because when we looked at some of the artifacts, of course we knew that the copper certainly dated, you know, based upon what we thought at the time and based upon other people's research, we thought that the copper dated to maybe the old copper culture, and maybe there were some woodland things that were mixed in. But when we looked at the lithics, some of the stone material, they really looked to be, they matched up not only very close, they matched up perfectly to what you would see on early Archaic or late Paleo-Indian sites. And of course, but what we didn't find was, we didn't find any diagnostic artifacts. And when I say that, we didn't find any projectile points, okay? And that's really what you need to find, you know, in order to prove, of course, that you're on a site that's in a sense, that dates back to those time periods. And that's because, you know, and I'm telling you things that you already know. And I see this is actually sitting out here out in the hallway out here. But that's because, you know, archaeologists have done a nice job of you know, through typology, of dating the, you know, projectile points. And that's because they actually, you can date them. Certain styles of projectile points with certain technology, certain materials were only used for certain periods of time, and then they weren't, that technology, that style, and whatever, and that use of whatever, you know, whatever they were hunting, that went away, and it never came back. And that's particularly true when you look at, like, that's true for most of the projectile points, and although there's some mixing in here, but that's particularly true for Paleo-Indian, early Archaic points. That these points are, particularly for, whether it be earlier Paleo-Indian or late Paleo-Indian, the styles are very, very distinctive, and they're very easy to recognize today. And based upon that, you can pretty much, if you find one of these on a site, you can pretty much, you obviously can date the site to that time period, okay? And so that's what we didn't find. But it really made me stop and think, you know, at the time, to me, I was super excited. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, not only did we find a site here in Marquette County, here on Teal Lake, that dates back to the prehistory, we got something that might date way back in the prehistory. It might be it's probably a multi-component site that probably dates back to Paleo-Indian times. And of course, there was obviously a lot of doubt from the professional archaeologists at that time. Remembering, of course, that there was doubt within the professional world that there were even sites in Marquette County, let alone Paleo-Indians, okay? And so, but I thought, well, if there's sites on Teal Lake, there's got to be sites just about everywhere. And so that's actually was right after we completed the work with NMU on the lake. I immediately went to the next lake, and that was Goose Lake, which sat actually pretty close to Negaunee, if you know where that is. It's to the east of Negaunee. And I went to an area where we did a lot of camping when I was growing up, and it was off the east end of the lake in a very, very nice spot, you know, for camping. And I can tell you this, if it's a nice spot today, guess what? It always has been a nice spot. And it's one of them sites that, you know, when I say that I went to the Teal Lake site and I found it, it took me about a half an hour to find the first thing. This took me 5 seconds, okay? Because here's what happened. I drove to the lake site, and it's just a rustic dirt road that goes into the site. And then there's a rustic boat landing that's just there in an old dirt road. And the area's been dug up there's been campers and some other activity that's in there. I opened the door of my car, and when I stepped onto the ground, I looked in the road, and the road was littered with quartzite flakes, right where I stepped. And I went, oh my gosh, you know. And so I hit it again. And as I walked the areas, and I surface collected all of the disturbed areas throughout the site, and there was quite a few. Like this is the roadways. There was a railroad that goes through there. They were doing some logging there at the time, or they put a big log landing right on the site, destroyed a large portion of it. But as I walked there, and I spent many days just surface collecting and recording where I was finding everything, this is some of the things that I found. It was incredible. And again, I'll say 90%, but it's probably more like 99% of everything I found was made from quartzite. And most of it was all local quartzites. This is agibic quartzite. It's a different grade of agibic. Geologically, it's still considered agibic, but it's from an outcropping that occurs on the lake itself, on the north shore of the lake. It's got a purplish iron staining hue to it. But I found thousands of flakes of this material just strewn all about, plus a lot of formal artifacts. And here, and some of these artifacts are really unique. This is a large flake, and you can see that there's a serrated edge that's made all the way along the edge here. And it's a huge uniface, huge butchering tool. And then there was a lot of bifaces. Here you can see this elliptical shaped knife. It's got a little bit of piece that busted off here, but a very well made knife. I'll call it a probably a cutting implement made from Ajibic quartzite. And this is more of a semi-lunar shaped knife because it's got a backing. It's got a backing here, which probably was the handle end, and which has got some grinding on it besides, which is telling you something. But and you got a really nice sharp edge that's still along here. And that's made from Menard quartzite. And in Marquette County, you have there's Ajibic, Menard, and Goodrich quartzites. And the Menard and the Ajibic quartzites are very, very good high grade. I say high grade. I say that in terms of stuff that you can make, raw material that you can make stone tools from. And this comes from outcroppings that occur actually almost from Negaunee all the way to Marquette. Okay, the big vast outcroppings of quartzite is that Menard quartzite right there. And of course, once again, when I compared and others began to compare this surface collection of tools that came off of Goose Lake, they looked to be Paleo-Indian. And there were so many of them. It wasn't like there was just one example. There was multiple examples that as you looked at the different assemblages throughout time that other people had found, these things were matching up with very, very early assemblages. But again, no, we didn't find any of those. I didn't find any of those when I did the surface collection. There was no diagnostic artifacts. And it was, I changed my mental focus, if you will, that I made a decision that what I was going to do was that I was going to prove that not only was there all these sites here in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I'll say in Marquette County, but there were Paleo-Indian sites there. That these things were too close not to be what I thought they were. But I also knew that in order to do it, I had to find this. I had to actually find the little needle in the big haystack. And I'll tell you what, when I first started the search, there was a lot of people that thought I was a joke. They said, well, you're never going to do it. And one of the reasons they did, because nobody previous to this had ever documented even one single Paleo-Indian point, or even early Archaic point, but any Paleo-Indian point from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. No one had ever documented one. No one had ever, maybe someone found one, but nobody had ever documented one. And so that same summer of 1985, what happened too was that the Mining Journal got a hold of the story of the excavation, or excuse me, of the survey project that was on Teal Lake. And so they put a big front page article on the front page of the Mining Journal and talked about the fact that we had actually found this prehistoric site right here in the UP. And of course, a lot of people read it, obviously. And this is one of the guys that read the article. And you talk about, again, being in the right place at the right time. His name is Brad Waters, and some of you may recognize him because he's the guy that heads up the Cliff Shaft Museum. He's done a lot of work as a historian, back in Ishpeming. And but Brad calls me up on the phone and he says, Jim, he says, hey, listen, he says, I found something that I think is an Indian artifact. He said, you think you'd be able to recognize it if it is? And I said, sure, probably. And I said, what do you think it is? And he says, I think it's, and this is what he tells me, he says, it's a quartz scraper. That's what he tells me on the phone, a quartz scraper. And I said, well, next time you're in town, just bring it by the house and I'll take a look at it. Well, he says, well, I'm coming into town. He said, I'll bring it over right now. I said, sounds good. And Brad lived up in North Ishpeming. I lived in Negaunee. I'm out in the front yard. Brad walks out, gets out of his truck, and he walks up just as you see him here, and he holds this thing up in his hand. And I went, don't move, I'm gonna get my camera. And I ran back into the house because I recognized it immediately what he was holding in his hand. He was holding in his hand, made out of Hickston silicified sandstone, was a classic late Paleo-Indian agate basin spear point. And the only thing that's missing, of course, is the very, very tip up here. And anybody who's handled or seen Paleo-Indian artifacts, your eyeballs light up when you see something like this. And so I said, oh my gosh, this is it. This is what I was looking for. I can't believe it. And so what I did was I asked him if he'd leave it at the house, and he did. I said, because I want to document this, and I want to get all the documentation down to Halsey down in Lansing. And so I had it, and I photographed it. I took these professional photographs of it, and I actually made a drawing of it with that showed all of the flaking pattern and the such. And I put together all of the information that Brad had given me, and I fired it off down to Halsey down in Lansing. And I was, again, ecstatic. And the next thing I was expecting was to have this parade of archaeologists come to my front door, pick me up on their shoulders and parade me around because I had did it. That never happened, okay? And so after a while I thought, wow, you know, and I finally got a thank you note back from John, and he says, you know, thanks for the information, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, that's it? You know what I mean? That's it? And so I went and I talked to Marla, and I said, Marla, I said, you know, it seems to me that I provided this documentation on something that nobody expected to find, and everybody said doesn't even exist here. And I said, and yet I get like this blank look from people and like no response. And she gave me at that point the greatest lesson that I ever had on archaeology. Because what Marla says to me is, she says, well, that's all fine, Jim. She says, you did a really nice job of documenting the fact that this point exists here in the UP. She says, but how do you know that Brad found it there? And I said, well, what do you mean, how do I know? I said, because he told me. She says, but how do you know that Brad found it there? And I said, well, because he told me, and he's an honest guy. She says, no. She says, what proof do you have? What proof does Brad have that he actually found that there? Because he comes to you 2 to 3 years after he said he found it somewhere, and he tells you where he found it, but did he document it in any way? Did he take a picture? Did he write it down? Did he do anything? And I went, no, Brad did not do any of that. And so I understood what she was saying, that if you're going to prove something, you need to have the proof. You need to do proper documentation. And especially if you're going to change an entire paradigm of the field of archaeology, and the paradigm was that, well, there's very few sites and there's no Paleo-Indians. And if you're going to push that door wide open and say, oh yeah, there is, well, you better be able to prove it, because there's going to be skeptics out there, and they need to be skeptics. That has to happen. They have to be skeptical of it. So you got to do it right. And so what I thought, so I knew what I had to do. I knew that I had to make the discovery. And here's what my goal was at that point in time. I thought, here's what I'm going to do. I am going to be the person, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to find it. And when I find it, not only am I going to document it, I'm going to do more than that. I'm going to grab the closest archaeologist by the ear, and I'm not going to touch it. Whatever I find, I'm not touching it. I'm leaving it there, and I'm going to pull them out there, and I'm going to say, there. And I understood the value of that, the power of that. And I don't mean that to say it in any disrespect, but I understood what Marla was telling me, that if you're going to prove it, you better have the proof. And this is a big one. And so my goal then became, what I was going to do, I was going to be the person to try to make that discovery, but it was going to be different because it was going to be proof when I did it. And again, you know, there's times when the stars just automatically line up, because I set out on this, embark upon this quest for the Holy Grail, if you will, in a sense, at a time when, you know, when everybody's telling me you're going to fail and nothing's going to happen, and then all of a sudden, at the same time that I decide I'm going to go find it, they find high mercury levels in Deer Lake, in the Deer Lake Basin in North Ishpeming. And because of these high mercury levels that contaminated the lake as part of the remedial action program between Cliffs Natural Resources, it actually was Cleveland Cliffs at the time, and the Department of Natural Resources, they decide that what they're going to do is, back in 1985-86, was the only way to get rid of the mercury contamination, they thought at that time, was let's just drain the lake. We'll just drain the whole lake back, you know, to Lake Superior. And once we get rid of the water, then, you know, things, you know, it'll be good. The problem solved. Well, there was still mercury contamination. It didn't solve the problem. But here's what it did. And this is a great photo. This is a photo that's taken, these photos, both of these photos were taken standing in the exact same spot. Okay, I'll say that to start with. And here you can see I took a picture because I liked the sunset. And I took this picture because I liked the fact that the lake was drained. And you can see, drained the basin, the Deer Lake Basin. It exposed the original Deer Lake, the original lake. And it's just a small, in the Deer Lake Basin was like 660 acres, I think, or something like that. But the original lake is only a small little 100-acre lake. It's like a big, more like a huge pond more than anything, because it's not a very big lake. And this is a photo that was taken after they drained, this is a photo that's taken after they drained the basin. And you can see this is the inlet, which is the Carp River, which feeds into that little lake right here. And just over in the corner, you can't see it, but the Carp River goes in and it goes out. It goes in and goes out on the same end of the lake. It's kind of odd geologically how that lake is set up. And at that time, I also met John Gordo. And John Gordo was, he had actually been a student of Marla Buckmaster's at NMU and had gone through a couple of her field schools. And John agreed with me. He agreed that based upon what my thoughts were on Paleo-Indians being in the UP, based upon his research and his thought processes that were going along at the same time, he agreed. And he says, why don't we, I'll join you in the search. He says, let's get out on that lake. He said, there's a golden opportunity to walk along a lake, the original lake that was formed some 11 or some 12,000 years ago, and we can walk that shoreline and maybe something's there. And I said, yeah, there's a good idea. And so we did it, and we started, but we didn't start till late in 1986. We started a little bit later in the early fall, and we found things that you would expect to find in a reservoir bottom. Of course, we found fishing poles, we found old wooden rowboats and the such. But lying amidst some of the historic artifacts that skirted around the lake, there were surface artifacts that we ended up surface collecting and documenting. And again, anybody who looks at these artifacts, if you have ever had any experience dealing with Paleo-Indian artifacts, your eyeballs are going to light up when you see these, because this is Hixton, this is an orange Hixton, that's white, more of the white typical that you see of the Hixton, the gray colors. These are again our blade tools from non-local quartzites. Okay, these aren't from around here, and so we knew that we were on the right trail. But what happens every year back in Ishpeming is exactly what happens every year here. Winter comes, and we, of course we got hit with snow, and that was the end of the project for then. So we couldn't wait till 1987 till the spring to show up, and people. I don't know if anybody here, I asked this question before, does anybody remember the winter of 1987? Everybody's going to go, do you remember it? Okay, there's some people who actually remember it. I asked that question, usually no one does, except one time a guy raised his hand. He said, oh yeah, I remember winter of 1987. He started rattling off all of these statistics on rain or on snowfall and everything else. It was Carl Bonack, and he happened to be in the audience. It's a true story. I said, well, Carl Bonack actually remembers what it was like in 1987, but I don't expect anyone else to. But anyway, 1987, the winter of 86, 87 was a very, very different year than what we usually encounter here in terms of winter, because we were actually in a regional drought at the time, actually, and so there was very little rainfall the previous fall, very little snowfall. But the other thing that happened was it was very, very warm. It was nice that winter, so there was little snowfall, very warm. There were several thaws, and it occurred. And so what happened was that by the time March rolled around, the first day of spring back in Negaunee, it actually looked like the first day of spring. The sun was shining, most of the snow had melted out of my yard and such. And that morning, the morning of March 21st, I'd gone to Marquette with my wife, and we had 4 kids in the back seat, and we headed up to Marquette just to do some shopping. And I'm looking at all of this nice warm weather, and I know the snow's melting, and I can't wait. I've been sitting there all winter waiting to get out to Deer Lake. I'm just itching. And this is an honest-to-God true story, okay, what I'm going to tell you. And I know yesterday Richie was up here, and he was talking about some of these, what he thought were some visions or whatever that he thought that he saw, and then something happened afterward. Well, understand what he was saying and believe him. Because here's what happens to me. We're coming back from Marquette, and I just come into Negaunee, and actually coming down across the Carp River Bridge, going to head up into Negaunee. And I'm looking out the window, and I don't even know how to describe it, because it gets kind of weird when you talk about it now. Because I don't want to say it was a vision or a premonition or anything else. But I saw in my mind a Paleo-Indian spear point laying on the surface. And it wasn't just the Paleo-Indian spear point. It was, in my mind, I could see a Scottsbluff spear point. Honest to God. And I told my wife, and she's sitting over there, and kids are yapping in the back, and I said, you know what I'm going to do today? I said, I'm going to get a hold of John Gordo. I'm going to head out to Deer Lake. I'm going to go find a Scottsbluff spear point. Now, my wife had no idea what a Scottsbluff spear point was. And she looked at me, first of all, like I was nuts. And she just basically ignored what I just said. When I got home, I called John, and I said, John, I know there's some bare spots on the north shore of that lake. What do you say we get out there this afternoon? We got a little bit of daylight left. Let's head out there. John said, yeah. And John lived just a couple blocks away from the lake. He lived in Deer Lake location. And so I went over and I picked up John. I drove over to his house, picked him up. We drove down to the lake. I got out of my car, and I told John, I said, let's go find a Scottsbluff spear point. I actually said those words, okay? And so we took off, but on where we parked, it was still snow on the south side of the lake. We had to get to the north side of the lake where it had more of the exposure to the sun, which you can see here. And there were still lots of spots where there was snow, but there was this pretty good sized bare spot. And it was also in a spot where the previous fall, we had found one of them really nice Hickston unifaces. So we headed right to that site, we zeroed in on it. And when we got there, we started walking, and it took a while just to get accustomed to the fact that you're looking at snow and mud, and you know, it hadn't rained yet, so things are lifted up from frost, and so it was really awkward trying to see anything on the surface. And it took us a little while, and we for the first maybe half an hour or so, we didn't see anything. And I remember John saying, "We're not finding anything, not even a flake over here," and he was getting a little bit discouraged. And we stopped to talk. And we're talking about it. I said, well, let's just continue searching. And I remember in John, he was going to walk south direction. I was going to walk north direction. But we're only a matter of a couple feet away. And we only got about 20 feet apart. And John hollers to me. And I'm walking this way looking like this. And John goes, "Jim, get over here, quick. You got to come see this." And I turn and I look at John, and he's kneeling down. And he's kneeling down, and he's focused on the ground. And I don't think anybody here knows John Gordo, but John Gordo is one of the most unexcitable human beings you ever met in your life. He's very, very boring. Great friend of mine, but very, very boring. And for John to be excited, I knew it had to be something. So I book her over to where John is kneeling, and he goes, "Look at this!" And here's what he's pointing at. And he's pointing at a Scottsbluff Paleo-Indian spear point laying in the rock matrix, as you can see. And I recognized it, again, immediately for what it was. It was a Scottsbluff spear point made from Hickston silicified sandstone. And again, the dates, I know we talked about this yesterday. One of our speakers was talking about how when you start throwing around dates, you're talking about archaeological times. You really got to be careful make sure you differentiate between radiocarbon dates and calibrated, calendar years. But these Scottsbluff spear points, it's a late Paleo-Indian projectile point that was used by people in here in North America, backdating. It's been found on sites that have the radiocarbon dates date from about 9,500 to 8,800 BP radiocarbon years, and that equates out to, in terms of calendar years, to around 10,800 to 9,000 to 9,800 calibrated before present years, and so. Conservatively, I always throw out the date. It's 10,000 years old because you're right in the ballpark when you say that. And but anyway, you can imagine how excited we were. I couldn't believe it. You're like in disbelief, but you're like dancing at the same time. And so that's so. And then right away, I mean, within a matter of seconds, we're just totally elated at what we found. We're kneeling on the ground now, and John goes, "Oh my God, here's another one." And he points off his leg, and there, laying in the rocks again, in the dirt, is another point. And then we both stand up and we go, "My God, here's another one!" And sure enough, laying next to that one was another Scottsbluff spear point. This one not made from Hickston, by the way, it's made from another material. And when we stood up and when we looked, we were standing on a surface concentration of Paleo-Indian spear points. And here you can see 3 of them. There's one here, and there's one just peeking out of the dirt right there. Well, we did it, and John and I were just, we thought, "Oh my God, I can't believe it, just can't believe it." And as we sat there, and then the next thought was, okay, now what do we do? And John, said, "Well, we got to get these out of here because someone else is going to come here and find them." I went, No. Here's what we're going to do, John. We're not touching them. We're going to leave everything here exactly as it is. Nobody's going to come over here. It's March. Nobody's going to come walking over here. Nobody's going to find these. We're going to leave them laying exactly as they are. We're going to go back and we're going to call every archaeologist we know and tell them to get their butt out here. And back then, the only archaeologist I knew was Marla Buckmaster. So, so I went back and we went back to John's house, and I can remember it was a weird feeling when you walk away from that. And I remember we walked away from it. And we got to John's house and called Marla, and she wasn't home, left a message, and she always laughs about this frantic message that we left on her answering machine. She still talks about it. And I could just imagine. We're blabbing on the phone. And then I actually called John Halsey down in Lansing, but at his office, but it was a Saturday, so I knew John wasn't going to answer. But I left a message on his phone of what we had found. And then what we did was, John went to his refrigerator and had 2 cans of Blatz beer in there, and we popped them tops on that Blatz beer, and we sat there and we drank our beer, and we celebrated, we clinked them glasses. And it was at that point that I told John, you know, one of the things that when you document a site and get a state site number, you know, with the state of Michigan, one of the great things about it is you get to name the site whatever you want. And I decided at that point that that the site was going to be called the Gordo site. And I just wanted to do it to honor John for the help, for what he had done. And he was actually the person that said, let's go there and look. And he invited me to be with him on that day. So in gratitude to that, I named it that. And when I think back through all of the years, I wish I had called it the Paquette site. No, just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, but I named it the Gordo site because of that. And that's why it's got the name, that's why it's called the Gordo site. And the other thing I did was, what we did was, we made immediate preparations. Marla called back. We made preparations for an immediate visit to that site the following morning. And Marla was going to gather up equipment and help, and she was going to come out to the site. And in the meantime, I called my dad, who was not only the greatest dad there ever was, he was one of the greatest photographers there ever was. He was a noted award-winning photographer. And I called my dad and I said, Dad, you ain't gonna believe what we found. I said, get every camera you got. I said, and fill them with film. I said, we need black and white and we need 35 millimeter Ektachrome. This is before the days of digital, of course. And so I said, grab every camera you got and load them with film. I'm gonna do the same. I said, we gotta take pictures of everything tomorrow. I said, I want pictures. I said, we're gonna get there early. We're gonna start taking pictures. We're gonna document this till everybody's sick of the documentation photos. And I actually said these words, this is kind of funny. I said, I want pictures of people taking pictures. If somebody has to go to the bathroom, you got to get a picture. So we can always sort of the pictures away later. My dad sort of laughed, but I didn't mean that. But I actually said those words to him. Well, anyway, the next morning, my dad and myself and John were the first on the site. This is my dad, Bob Paquette. And he showed up with his camera equipment, I showed up with mine. And we were waiting yet for Marla, because Marla had to go, it was Sunday morning. Marla had to go to the lab, pick up equipment, pick up John Anderton and a few other things. And head out to the site. So she was going to be a little bit late. But we got there first, and we got, again, for the second time, to actually look at what we had found the day before and to see the artifacts. And we got to take the very first photographs of these incredible artifacts that were laying there. And some of the photographs themselves are pretty incredible. When I look back at these photographs, and that's one of the very first photographs that we took, and that's the first projectile point, the first spear point that John had pointed to. That's artifact number one from the Gordo site. And that's just, to me, that's just an incredible photo, you know, because of the rock matrix and everything else. Very shortly afterwards, though, after we had taken photos, and oh, and by the way, that's when my dad decided to take this trophy shot here, because before anybody got there, my dad said, hey, Jim, you and John get over there and stand, and the artifacts are actually laying right in front of us here. He says, stand there and shake hands. And I just felt kind of silly doing it, but we did it, and we stood there and shook hands, and that photograph's been around a lot now. And I'm really glad that my dad talked us into doing that, and we took that silly photograph. But anyway, shortly afterwards, Marla shows up, and my good friend John Anderton shows up. And John Anderton, back at that time, was still a student. He was a student at Northern, and he actually was a lab assistant. Marla did a lot of work in the archaeology lab. Worked on a lot of different things with Marla. But John was a good friend of mine already, because he was actually a homeboy from Negaunee as well. And this is my dad standing here. And the first thing that Marla did when they came in off this end of the lake, and you can see the lake is still obviously froze. And you can see this is looking south. And we taped off, what we saw was the surface concentration of artifacts is sitting right in here. It's actually in a rather small tabletop area that sits right in the center here. And I took a photo of Marla and John as they were setting up this little banner to basically just guard off this area where the artifacts were. And the next thing, of course, that we did was to very carefully locate each and every surface artifact. And that's what John is doing here, because we were prepping to take the all-important documentation photos. We were going to photograph these in the proper way so that we could prove what we found. And of course, here's Marla. What she's doing here is she's setting up to take one of the photos. And here you can see it says Gordo site, 322/87 surface. She's got a directional arrow that she's being very careful to set up there facing north. And laying right in there, of course, is one of the artifacts. We took those, we duplicated them, we took them in black and white, and then we took them in color ectochrome so that we had black and white, because Marla said, we got to take them in black and white. And I'm thinking, well, that's okay. Yeah, let's do it. And, but I also knew that people like looking at color. And so we took them in both ectochrome and with color slide film and so on. These are just some of the photos. Then the next thing we did, after we photographed everything in place, next thing we had to do was to set up our boundaries, to set up our unit, because we were going to very carefully measure the exact locations of each and every one of these surface artifacts. And this is a photo that my dad took this, obviously with the black and white film in the camera. And he shot this photo. This photo's actually showed up in a lot of different places through the years. And it shows there's John Anderton, there's Marla, there's me. That's Lois. I forgot to mention, Lois Gordo, John's wife, came out. She's the one that guided Marla and John to the site. And of course, there's John. And what they're doing here is they're beginning to set up we're going to set up 2 adjacent 2 meter by 2 meter units. And we're going to dissect, the units are going to dissect, the boundaries between the 2 units are going to dissect right between what we think is the center of the surface concentration. And here you can see these are just more, this is a photo that I took. And again, if you ever go to the Marquette Regional History Center, this photograph covers a whole wall down out at the museum. Because it's a great photograph that I took when we were just setting up the units. And again, this is looking west onto the original lake. And you can see that this is the inlet is over here, and that's the outlet over there. And you can see the lake. And we're beginning to get set, we're just setting things up here. Now, of course, once we set up the units in our boundaries, you know, everything was measured, everything was recorded exactly where it was, you know, on paper and on the square sheets. And one of the things that very few people have ever seen these, and so this is going to be a treat for you people here today. These are the original square sheets that we drew up that day. These are historic square sheets. And this is the surface, this is the day that we did it. And there's Marla Buckmaster, John Anderton, Jim Paquette, and John Gordo. I always wish my dad's initials had been on there, because he was there, but we never put them on there. These are the surface artifacts as they lay on these 2, again, these lines here touch. These are 2 adjacent 2 meter by 2 meter units, okay? And then it was only after we had photographed and measured and drawn in and properly documented everything were we finally able to pick these stone artifacts up. Now was the best part of the whole day. And this is a photograph that my father took when I picked up that very first artifact, number 1, and I held it in my hand. And I'm here to tell you, and I know there's people here that have experienced it, and they know what I'm saying and what I'm going to say. But there's something about picking up for the first time in 10,000 years, something that's laid there that was left by someone else, and you're the first person to pick it up and hold it in your hand. And I don't like to use the word magic, because that's not necessarily a good word, but it's magic. And when you do it, when you feel it, it's not even something you can describe, and that's why I use the word magic, because I don't even know what word is the right word to describe the feeling, the power that comes over you when you pick that up and you hold it in your hand. It's just an incredible thing. And I love that photograph. This is a photograph John got to pick up. This is another one of the surface artifacts. Incredible. Scotts Bluffs Point, made from that nice orange Hickston silicified sandstone. Just an incredible artifact. Well, that was what we did that first day on the project, on the excavation project. Now keep in mind that it's spring of the year, and one of the things that we're worried about, of course, they're trying to salvage, in a sense, what's there. And I use the word salvage because what's happening is it's on a reservoir, right? And the dam has already been ordered closed. And so the water is coming up, okay, within the reservoir, so that we know that we've only got a limited amount of time to actually excavate on this particular site. And but that day, we got a lot accomplished that first day, because it took us all day to do the things that you just saw, because we did it very slowly, very methodically. We did it right. But that night, I'll say that night, but later that afternoon, we got everything carefully packaged up and ready to pack out in our backpacks. And I remember standing there on that site, and you did not feel like you were alone, if you understand what I'm saying. And I know yesterday Rich had talked about, he feels that when you go to these cultural sites that the spirits of people are still there. And he talked about that from a cultural aspect and what his beliefs are. And I'll tell you what, I'm sitting back there nodding my head because I remember standing on that site. We were next to that excavation unit. We got what we had packed up, and you weren't alone. You could just feel it. And it was like, we're standing on this ridge, we're looking back, and this is a painting that was actually done for Lake Superior magazine for an article that I wrote for them. And a painter from Duluth actually had painted this. And it's actually supposed to be, and I switched it around because it's actually supposed to be Duluth in Paleo-Indian times. But it looks incredibly like Deer Lake if you flip it around, like where we actually excavated in the hills off to the north, the big outcroppings of rock that bluffs that border the north side of the lake. And so that's what that photograph is, or that painting is of that. But it almost felt like that's what was happening there when we were there. And so, but we walked off the lake. Go ahead. What happened was the next day we decided to excavate on the site. And what we were going to do is, we were already happy. We took off the surface concentration. We didn't expect to find anything. We just thought that we had already picked it clean in a sense. We went back to excavate. When we excavated, we couldn't have been farther from the truth. We had hit the tip of the iceberg. And as we excavated, we were using trawls, and we began to encounter many broken fragments of points. And it got to the point where you couldn't excavate with a trawl without moving pieces of these artifacts. So we resorted to using paintbrushes of broken point fragments under the surface. And here you can see, this is a great photograph that shows here, and here, these point fragments that were showing up. And here is another one of the point fragments. Of course, we screened, everything was being carefully screened. John Franson, on that particular day, John Franson showed up on this day so that we could map the site. And he brought his survey skills there from Escanaba. He spent a day there. He mapped things out so that in the future we'd be able to find this again because it was in the lake bottom. And there's what we found that first day of excavating. Again, couldn't believe it. And again, there was this concentration, and we're doing in 10 centimeter levels, by the way. And we got down in the first 10 centimeters from surface. This is every place you see a flag or a bag, that's a fragment of a spear point that we found in there. And these are, I don't know what happened to that photograph over there, but these are the square sheets from that first day of excavating. And that's the end of the day when we were getting ready to leave. Now, here's the sad thing. March 22nd, March 23rd, again here in Houghton, that might be spring, but in Negaunee, that's still winter. And I know it's still winter here. And even though it was spring and we had a nice spring, you're going to get some snow. And we ended up almost that same week with a storm that dumped almost 2 feet of snow onto the site. And so we had to wait for that to melt. The other problem we had was that John and I had made a decision that we weren't going to touch the site unless Marla Buckmaster was there herself. And so we were not going to do anything. And although we had time to be there and to work on it, we decided we weren't going to do that we weren't going to screw this up in any way. Problem for Marla was she's teaching at Northern, so she's got classes every day, and she's trying to work her work schedule into her other priorities and everything else. And so Marla only shows up a total of 3 more days at that site, okay? And it was very, very frustrating for John and I, and I'll be honest with you, we were actually getting a little bit mad about the whole thing. And if I had to go back and do it over again, I probably would do the same thing, because at the time my skills were very, very limited. Today, I know a lot more about how to do proper excavations and such, so if it was today, I'd have been in there. But back then, we made the right decision and decided that we weren't going to do anything, we'd just leave it there. And what was frustrating was this right behind me. That water's coming up. And we know that every day that goes by, that water's inching closer and closer and closer. Now, on the very last day that we were there, when I had your very last day that we were there, we found something. This is my excavation unit. On May 5th, I found, when I was excavating, we were using trawls here, of course, and I was in the sand and I seen this. And I thought, well, that's a real odd little feature. And I showed it to Marla, and she says, boy, that sure looks like it might be a post mold, you know, the remains of a post that had been driven into the ground. And so we said, let's cross-section it. And if we cross-sectioned it, of course, what you're going to expect to find is this triangular, you know, shaped staining in the ground. And it's exactly what we found. I don't know how well this shows up here with the lighting here, but it's exactly what you would expect to find is exactly what we found. So we highly suspect that this was a post mold, that it was remains of some sort of a scaffold or structure that had been in that place. And this is the very last artifact that was found, that was recovered that day. So we were still finding artifacts on the last day that we excavated. That's artifact number 116. It's a blade fragment off of a point. Excuse me, I gotta go back here. And that was it. 60 days. This photo was taken 60 days after the discovery. And you could tell by the look on John's face that we weren't very happy with the fact that we had not completed the excavation, that we were still finding things, that we had not expanded it in any way, and that it was going to take probably forever to get back to the site. But we were happy. One side of us was we're saddened by what we didn't get done, but we were ecstatically happy by what did get done. And of course, we had found, it was the find of 1,000 lifetimes. What we found, of course, we had found all of these incredible perfect projectile points that you see here, these Higgston points that you see, the two that I'm holding in my hand. But the big mystery was the dozens and dozens of burned point fragments that were recovered. And of course, we took all of these fragments back to the archaeology lab up at Northern and put them on a table, and it's like this giant Paleo-Indian jigsaw puzzle. And John spent hours and hours of piecing pieces back together. And when he completed piecing every piece that could possibly fit to something else, it was just incredible what we found. Because he pieced together, and these are just some of the points, because there was like 34 projectile points that were represented at the site. And these are just some of them right here. And again, very definitely, these are the sites. This tells you this is the age of the site, because these are the points that we found there. We've not only found Scottsbluff points, and this is the amazing thing about the site. There was also hardened points, which we would classify as hardened, but there was also early archaic side-notched St. Charles dovetail points and a Thebes point. So think about that. And anybody who knows anything about the early archaic transition from Paleo-Indian, late Paleo-Indian, here in the Upper Great Lakes, but you also know that that there's an interface of that time when those certain points are being used in different parts of the country here. There was a combination of all of them points are in this one spot. And no one's ever gone back and really studied and tried to determine why that is. But the big mystery was, why were they burned? Okay, why were they destroyed? And they not only were burned, some of the points you can see, they were actually intentionally fractured. They weren't just burned from being subjected to intense heat. They were also, some of these points were fractured. They were actually broken. And why were they all in that one little spot? And why 10,000 years ago did someone take their most prized possessions and leave them there? And the research tells us, and here's what we think we know, based on what other people have found. First of all, we know the material's coming from here. This is where Higgston Silver Mound is located, down in Jackson County, down in Wisconsin. At the Pope site, someone found something exactly what we found at the Gordo site. They found Scottsbluff Higgston silicified sandstone points broken, probably broken because they're subjected to heat. And here at the Renier site, Carol Ehrman and Ron Mason found something that was very, very important. They found exactly what we found in terms of artifacts, because they found broken, burned projectile points. And what they found there was they found burned human bone, so I am done here. And so they found burned human bone there, and just small pieces of it, but it told them that they had that they had found a cremation burial, and they found where the remains of that. And that's what we think we found also on Deer Lake, that we had found the remains of a cremation burial, things that were put with someone who had died there, and things laid there until we found it. And what makes the Gordo site so important was that it was, first of all, it was the first site, the first, as reported in Wisconsin archaeologists, the first unequivocal evidence of a late Paleolithic occupation here in the UP. And also it's the largest single collection of Scottsbluff points ever found anywhere, and here in the Great Lakes region. And it's the only excavated and documented Scottsbluff site here in the state of Michigan. And our search continues. We've continued to find other things, things that are even older, because it opened up the door to our research. And the last thing I want to say, and I'll quit here, is that the reason they're important, I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning. It's important for what it tells us from an archaeological sense, but artifacts are important And we can never forget this because they're gifts. They're actually gifts that are given to us by our ancestors. People who can't talk to us anymore. They can't tell us. They can't write to us. The only way they can communicate with us and tell us who they were and that they were here is by transferring information through the artifacts that they left behind to us. And through archaeology, through the science of archaeology, we can decipher what they're saying, okay? And that's why it's important to do things right. Artifacts aren't just beautiful things that should be kept, and they are beautiful things, there's no doubt about it. But there's more to it than just the beauty of an artifact. It's the knowledge that you gain from the artifact that's really the treasure that lies within it. Last thing I want to say real quick, I got copies of the book that I wrote, Find of a Thousand Lifetimes. I got them for only 20 bucks today. Usually they cost you 30 bucks at Barnes & Noble or wherever if you don't buy them on the internet. But I have got copies of it back there, so that's it. Thank you.